Hi everyone, welcome back to Rocks for Jocks. I am joined once again by my friend and former research colleague, Christina Sanon. Christina and I worked together while graduate students at Tufts University, and she's now in the final stages of her PhD. Christina was a guest on this show almost a year ago, so I thought it'd be a lot of fun to have her on again to share any updates from research or life, see what else she's publishing soon, and any other updates from the science world she wants to talk about. If you like this episode, please send it to a friend or family member. If you hate it, send it to an enemy. But for real, please subscribe on Apple or Spotify or wherever you're listening and send it to a friend whenever you get the chance. I love making this show, and the more people that listen to every episode get me more excited to make the next one. Now, kick back and enjoy the show. Hey, Christina, how's it going? How are you doing?
Doing okay. Some really good news. This is the last of it. This is the last semester. It's not officially on paper, but it's been spoken out loud. It's happening.
That's fantastic. Congratulations. What else is going on in your world?
You would have totally loved today's seminar. It was with Shafiq, who I'm sure you've interacted with plenty. I think he would be a really good guest. He loves talking about his work. He's the person to talk water diplomacy with. So his talk today was on sea level rise in Boston, but he has a really, really cool way of saying, hey, like, what's the difference between these policies? Like, it's all about, people making the right choices and spending the money when it needs to be spent for the long haul. He also made a really good point where he's like, a lot of places don't necessarily invest for the long run because they know that they will be bailed out by the federal government. Like if something happens here in Boston, right, we know that the federal government will come in and say, oh, we need to repair. So why spend the money to build better, to not have these things happen when that money can be used for other things? So it was a very interesting talk. So I think he would be like a really good person to talk to. And I'm sure he'd love to. He'll probably take over the whole conversation though, because he's one of those people who like ask questions. You'll say like, good morning, professor. He'll be like, who are you? Tell me about yourself. And then you're like, I really just wanted to wish you a good morning.
That's too funny. Yeah, I'm always looking for more people. I've been hesitant to contact and pursue professors too much yet because I feel like I'm assigning more value to their time than graduate students, I guess.
So I'm not offended at all because, they're writing grants, they're doing all these things, managing like groups and stuff.
Sure. Yeah. I'd love to hear an update on how your life and your program is going as well.
I'm seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. That's what's going on. I think just last year was when I was last on here. In my mind, I had so much more left. And this past December, I just kind of had this hunger to really finish. And the hunger really came from, one, seeing everybody leave, you included. And really the most important reason is because I was getting too comfortable. I think sometimes when you get too comfortable, you have to make a decision whether this is where you want to be forever or if there's something else out there that's going to challenge you a little bit more. And I'm not saying my PhD hasn't challenged me because it has, but I think when, at least for me, I find myself sometimes getting really comfortable in situations and not wanting to leave because I don't know what's ahead. I'm a little afraid of what's ahead, so I stick to what I know. And it was just getting to a point where I was coming in, I come into the office every day and I know exactly what I'm doing. I turn on my computer and I'm like, where's my Python code? Where is this? I'm just clicking away. And it's comforting to know that there's something that I know very well, but also it's a little scary to think that that's not exactly what I want for the rest of my life, but I'm so comfortable doing it that I would allow myself to do it forever.
Hey, I mean, getting comfortable with academia and and like breezing along your last few months of a PhD, that to me feels like you're doing a pretty good job. You're doing something pretty well. I feel like most people doing a PhD struggle every day and grind it out, especially towards the end. So the fact that you're feeling comfortable about it, I feel like that's a green flag.
I mean, yeah, yes and no. It's a green flag after you struggled for, say, like 4 years, right? Trying to figure out what it is that you're even doing.
Yeah.
So when you get to the point where you're like, I'm cruising through, it feels really good. But when it's to a point where you're like, I would rather do this than put myself out there to figure out what's out there.
Sure.
Then that's when it gets to a point where you're like, maybe I should leave. Maybe I should actually start applying for jobs and letting people know that I actually do have some skills that I'm pretty comfortable in.
Do you have a sense of what those next couple of steps are going to be for you?
I really, really wanted a government job, especially given the nature of what I do.
Yeah.
I wanted to do that.
Like one of the national
But
labs kind of thing.
more on the front of, more like at the intersection of, say, like engineering and emergency management. So I was thinking, because like I was on their website pretty much every day. Like I was on that FEMA website, like looking to see when an opportunity would open for me and for me to just like fill it out and send it in.
Yeah.
And I think now I'm a little nervous about doing that. Not that I wouldn't do it if the opportunity presented itself, but I think I also have to be very smart about where I start. And I'm constantly reminding myself also that it doesn't have to be forever, right? It could just be like, and I hope hiring managers aren't necessarily listening to me say, I could work here for a year, then leave. But the reality of it is I could work at any place and then leave, right? For like a year if I don't like it. That's just kind of how
That's all. Yeah.
life
That's every
goes.
job.
I mean, it's a trade-off, right? If they do a bad job managing you and they're treating you poorly, then yeah, they can expect you to leave after a year or two. But conversely, if they do a good job and you're happy there, you can stay there for a really, really long time.
Exactly. But yeah, so that's kind of where I wanted to start, but I don't see that happening. I got to a point where I was kind of getting really desperate about like what my options are. So I asked ChatGPT, I was like, hey, this is what my research is. These are my skills. What do you think? And it suggested state and local governments. So I was like, why didn't I think of that? And in speaking with Lori, she goes, yeah, like you should look at state and local governments. They're smaller, they're not FEMA, but that's a good start. And I told her, I said, ChatGPT suggested the same thing.
That's too funny. I've got another good one for you. Perplexity is another one of those AI websites. And similarly, they can give you kind of mixed responses sometimes of good information, bad information. But the good thing is they do provide resources at the end of their responses. So they might say, hey, here are 6 different types of government jobs you can get, and then give you 3 different websites to go and check out a couple jobs each on those websites.
Oh my goodness, thank you for suggesting that. I will ask them.
Yeah.
Where should I apply?
Awesome. Okay. So it seems like you are going along here. You're chugging along, coming to work every day and know exactly what you're going to do, which is fantastic. So yeah, how are you feeling about all of that?
Such a good feeling. I'm sure you felt that way too towards the end of your degree, where maybe you're not necessarily saying, I've got it all figured out, but at least you've got the beginning and maybe the middle figured out, where you're not waiting for someone else to come in and say, why not try this? I think that's kind of when you also know that it's time to go, is when you're at a point where you can synthesize certain things on your own. I don't know that I necessarily always do a good job at doing that, but I know that I can implement it well on my own, if that makes sense.
Can you explain that a little bit more? What do you mean by that?
So I think in terms of generating research, which is one of the reasons why I'm like afraid of going down that academic route. Whenever someone asks me, the reason I give is that I don't think I'm creative enough in research to have my own lab group and to really take on the responsibility of, I guess, training someone else or multiple other people and saying, oh, there's this problem. I'm not necessarily really good at that. But I think one thing I found is that in the last year, not that I was necessarily saying, let me try these solutions to the problems, but I found myself understanding more of what the solutions needed to be, as opposed to, like a couple of years ago when I first started, it was, I started with the liquefaction project. It was run through this and do X, run through this and do Y. And I was just mechanically going down this list that I was more or less given to complete the project, right? Mm-hmm. But now I'm not necessarily given a list. Mm-hmm. I'm given an idea. And I'm like, oh, I know how to do this. So I think, in terms of implementation, I've gotten to a point where I'm really good at that.
I'll push back on that a little bit. I think implementing something you already know how to do is pretty valuable. You don't necessarily need to come up with a unique, crazy, creative solution that nobody's ever thought of before every single time you tackle a problem.
That's, someone else said that to me too. And I was like, when I look around, that's not the sense that I get. Okay, this is not going to sound the way I want it to sound, but I think I have I lead with humility a little too much sometimes, to the point where I get not starstruck, that's not the right word, but I'm I value what other people do so much that when I see them, I'm like, oh, you climbed Everest to get here. Or this is so creative. I think I don't necessarily have those skills because I don't see them in myself in the way that I see them in other people.
Do you feel like it's any kind of imposter syndrome at all?
Oh, absolutely.
Sure.
And maybe it's not, maybe it's true that I don't have them, but that's unfortunately how I lead in whatever situation. I'll go to conferences and I'll stand by my board and someone's standing by theirs. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this is so good. Their work is so good.
Christina, that's going to drive me up the wall here, because there's no way that our advisor, Lori, would let somebody get through her PhD program without making sure they were really advanced in problem solving and can tackle really complex issues from start to finish. So even if you don't want to take my word for it, take the word of your committee members, because they would not let you pass. They would not let anybody get through with just some nonsense in their dissertation.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah, of course. And there's a balance, right? You want to have humility and you want to be able to learn and acknowledge things you don't know. But yeah, don't sell yourself short either. You're pretty good at this stuff at this point.
Thank you.
Obviously you've gotten this far, you deserve it. You can absolutely get any of those jobs that we just talked about, or probably even stay in academia if you really wanted to. So yeah, I guess in that note, how are you feeling about those projects? How are you feeling about the last couple of abstracts that you've been putting together?
Oh my gosh, I love them. And I thought to myself, I wish that that's where I started. And I know, it's really hard when you're starting out to say exactly how the process is going to be for you, because it's not linear. You say, this is what I want, this is where I want to be. And then throughout the process, you are so far removed from that first idea. You really need to also play smart. You have to play into the expertise that's available to you. That's the first thing. But also, the most important one is funding, right? There are certain projects that you just kind of have to do because that's what's being funded. And I think for me, and maybe you can speak on this, but I've been lucky enough to work with someone who is just very curious about everything. And those two projects, the abstracts that I shared with you, they're not funded.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but it's just something that I'm interested in and she's also interested in. And so we've come together to make that happen. And I'm not saying she's made it happen for me. I think there is obviously the benefit that is getting exposure in that way with stakeholders, but also it's just, this is in some ways what I envision my projects would be. And so when we started, I want to say maybe last year, I was just kind of like, oh my gosh, where was this 2 years ago? And then that's another thing where now I'm cruising through them, right? And I'm at the end and I have all these other things that I'm like, I could do with these projects, but I no longer have the time. And it almost feels like the first 3 years, and I get it, the first 3 years were like the learning period. It was, you learn how to be a PhD student, you learn how to do research, and you're constantly modifying and reframing. So there's no way, I think that 3 years ago, if I had those projects, that I would have done as good a job as I feel like I'm doing now. So the lag did help, but also I'm like, shoot, like I really, really wish we had those two projects had.
Yeah, absolutely. And I gotta say, one of those abstracts I was obsessed with. And I'm guessing you probably could have guessed which one that was.
Okay, wait.
Guess.
Is it it's the last one, right? The comparison? Yeah?
Yeah, it's very similar to the work that I was doing when I was in school. It's certainly a much better version of the project than I was able to slap together in a couple of years.
That's not true.
And
If I can maybe try to give a quick 2 or 3 sentence summary, and then you can tell me how inaccurate that summary is after. I wrote some notes down here. It was late at night when I wrote the notes, so we're going to see how accurate this is. All right, so for the abstract number 2 that you sent over, the way I'm thinking about it is that it's a way of estimating losses in central and eastern United States, estimating earthquake losses using a bunch of, I guess, different hazard and vulnerability components. So you take shaking across the area, then you're checking kind of a factor that I'm going to call soil vulnerability. So like how susceptible the soil is to amplifying that shaking. Then you check the building vulnerability. So like how susceptible the building is to being damaged by that particular shaking. And then I'm not sure whether you did this or not, but like maybe cost per square foot to kind of get that damage estimate of how many dollars it took to repair each building based on different earthquake scenarios.
You are almost there, almost. So the big component here is that you're familiar with the area, the impedance contrast here in Massachusetts.
All right, Christina, and can you tell us all what an impedance contrast is? Pretend that I've been away from graduate school for a couple of years and completely forget what that means.
Okay, so the other way I know how to explain it is with light, but that's probably not a good idea either to explain it with light. But it's really that difference between the different soil medium that you have. So for instance, here in Massachusetts, we have this bedrock that really, starting from the top, you have sediment that transitions into bedrock, and that creates an angle, so to speak, and that amplifies the way a building would feel the shaking. So for instance, if you are, say, site class A, for instance, which is bedrock, when the ground shakes, say an earthquake occurs, the ground shakes, you're probably not gonna feel it too much, right? But then if you are, say, on sediment, something a little softer, then that amplifies what you have. And in Massachusetts, what happens, that transition is so quick from the bedrock to the sediment that it gets amplified. And then you get potentially what's called resonance.
Okay, and what's the difference between bedrock and sediment?
So bedrock is just your rock. Like when you think of how to explain it other than that, it's just rock.
My understanding of bedrock, I guess, is that it's almost like part of the tectonic plate, like stuff that's really far underground. While it may be moving around in the long run over scales of hundreds of thousands or millions of years, in the short term, you can think of it as just like one giant chunk of rock that's in one place and extends for kilometers in different directions. And it can reach up to the surface, but usually it's, I don't know, a couple hundred meters to a few kilometers underground. Does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, that is about right. So a lot of places you don't even ever reach bedrock really. So because you have a lot of, that softer material. And I'm trying to be careful about saying that softer material because I know that term, when you say soft material, geologists and engineers, everybody gets like, what is soft? Like, can you define soft? But something that is not rock solid, for lack of a better term. Whereas in Massachusetts, in most areas, we don't have that luxury of having the bedrock be so far down.
Okay, right. Because in some places, the bedrock, you can get outcrops of the bedrock at the surface, right?
That kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. So really what we are trying to do with this project is see where this impedance contrast is really going to impact our structures. The problem with resonance is that when the ground shakes, you get an earthquake. When the ground shakes at the frequency of the building, then that building feels it twice as much. As opposed to, say, if something's rocking side to side now, it's like really rocking side to side because the ground has amplified the shaking.
Great. And when you said the frequency of the building, can you explain what that means briefly?
Yeah, so every building has its own frequency. They're kind of like humans. We all have our like little personalities. And the frequency really depends on a lot of things, but really the building structural system, as well as its stiffness, as well as its height.
Mhm.
The height comes into play depending on the frequency of the ground shaking. So most people will say taller buildings will collapse when the ground shakes and there will be more damage. Yeah, just by nature, right? There will be more damage because it's a bigger, taller building. But that doesn't mean that if a low-rise structure shakes at the right amount of frequency, that there won't be a damage there. So both low-rise and high-rise structures are vulnerable depending on the frequency of the soil that they sit on and the frequency that it shakes, they will have the same impact.
Cool. Okay, so I'm going to get back to my version of summarizing your project here. So you're taking these hazard maps, which is kind of like expectations of where shaking occurs in a country. And you are calculating how much the local soil is going to amplify or dampen the shaking. And then doing some calculations as well on top of that to figure out how much a building in that location is going to respond to that particular kind of shaking based on impedance contrast and resonance frequencies. And then what are the final steps here?
The final steps, now that's the part that's really exciting. The final step of that is to bring the methodology, so to speak, into one of the NERI programs. NERI stands for Natural Hazards Engineering Research Infrastructure.
Yep.
Yes, a little bit of a mouthful. So what they do is they support earthquake research, and they have a few different avenues. I know you are maybe familiar with Design Safe. Am I correct in saying that?
Yep.
So that is part of the NERI infrastructure.
And can you remind me, Design Safe? Is that one of those big databases and they have a bunch of different data sets of projects that are all earthquake hazard related? Is that right?
Correct, yes. And they have developed something similar to HAZUS. It's called R2D. And I know it's like, I'm like
Yes.
spitting out
Sorry, I
like
was trying not to
acronyms.
comment.
I'm like spitting out acronyms, which is like funny because that's kind of how they do things. But R2D stands for Regional Resilience Determination. So R2, two R's, and then D for determination. It's similar to HAZUS, but HAZUS obviously is a FEMA-sponsored program, and R2D is NERI-sponsored, and they calculate loss, and it is free for us to use. So anybody who has, that same type of soil behavior with impedance contrast, they can just go in, put in their data, and run it.
Cool.
Because I would have already done the hard work for them.
Cool. So what kinds of inputs would they need in that scenario?
They would definitely need their area's soil properties. So like any sort of subsurface data that they have, they would need that. And of course, their own building stock.
Okay, so building stock, it's a set of, I'm guessing, building locations and characteristics across a region.
Correct.
Cool. And then what do they get out of it? Is there like a dollar value that pops out the other end?
They can get that depending on what their project calls for, or they can get a damage state estimate. So for instance, instead of saying, it's going to cost X amount of money to repair this building, they can say this building has this probability of being in this damaged state given this scenario earthquake. So like if you were to have a 5.4 shaking, this building here would probably experience slight damage or it would be completely destroyed or whatever.
Cool.
Which again, you can link to the dollar amount. Like if you have a slight damage versus, like something that's completely damaged, how much that's going to cost. And, depending on the stakeholder and who's responsible for the building stock or who owns the buildings, like how much money are they willing to pay to maybe like retrofit or put in like, some sort of mitigation strategies beforehand. I mean, nobody's saying, you're going to get a 5.4. These are just, scenarios, but it's better be prepared than, spending a bunch of money after the fact.
We got a pretty decent sized earthquake in Maine a couple of weeks ago.
Did you feel it?
I did. I was over the moon.
And did you feel it down?
That was really exciting for me.
Oh, nice.
I had my cat sit on the bed, and she was very confused at why the house was shaking, but she had no sixth sense beforehand or after. She was just like sleeping, totally chilled out, no concern in the world. And all of a sudden she's like, oh, I guess the house is shaking a little bit. And right afterwards went right back to sleep. So she would not survive an apocalypse. So we'll just put that up.
That's funny. I did not feel it. I was driving, I think, at the time.
Oh, really?
When I got in the office, that's when, we got the emails about, doing our part for research.
Yeah.
And I was like, wait, I didn't feel it.
Did Lori's research group have to do anything for it?
Ellie feels like I'm name dropping and I'm throwing out acronyms and everything. But her project is using data from all of these records of Did You Feel It?
Oh, sweet. Okay. So not the Maine earthquake specifically, but a project on the Did You Feel It reports that people filled out after larger events. And is she focused on East Coast? And is she focused on East Coast earthquakes?
It is Central Eastern U.S. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So going back to your project, it sounds like the goal is for people to be able to put in building stocks into the website and then in return be able to get out the damage ratios or damage states.
Damage state probabilities. Yeah.
So for example, 60% damage or 20% damage, those ratios, they can be represented by different damage states, like damage state 1, damage state 2, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
And those are based off fragility curves and fragility functions. So yes, they are a range of probabilities.
Okay. So it sounds like users input building locations and characteristics, then in return, using fragility functions, they're going to get probabilities of being in damage state 1 versus being in damage state 2, etc., where each damage state represents some damage ratio or range of damage ratios. Great. So tell me about the other project that you sent to me. What was that abstract about?
This one actually is the one that sort of gave rise to this idea. Like now that we know that this was possible, then we're just adding a little bit more to make it more interesting, but also make it so that it's a little bit more publishable as well. Because the one that I'm using, the second project, we can't publish the building stock because it's proprietary information, proprietary material. So I needed a way to make the work be reproducible. So part of that was saying, okay, now I know how to use HASIS and I have this connection now and I know how to use and make use of like fragility functions and fragility curves and getting, my damage states, which is essentially what that second project is, but it is a very specific building stock that we were asked to do this specific project for. Mm-hmm. The third project, I guess the difference is, well, there are a lot of nuances, but this first project, we used code values, so they were not scenario earthquakes. The reason for that was they needed something a little bit more concrete to say yes to retrofitting, no to retrofitting. So essentially, they're like your design values. So instead of like running the building through a scenario earthquake, we essentially compared the design spectrum. So the design spectrum essentially looks like what you would get from a scenario. It's the same thing in practice. It's just the values and the meaning of the values are different.
Okay.
So essentially we looked at if they would ever surpass what they're designed for.
Gotcha.
When you're looking at, say, like a scenario earthquake, say you have like a 5.4, right? Say you have a 5.4, that's like, I mean, I don't want to call it an isolated event, but for lack of a better term, it's just something that happens unexpectedly. But each building is designed to withstand a certain amount of load. What we did in that second project is to say, what if we loaded it with its maximum designed earthquake load?
Okay. What did you find?
So, I mean, going into it, we knew that unreinforced masonry wasn't the best design option.
Like a brick building stacked together kind of thing?
Correct, yes. It's unreinforced. Between the mortar, there's no rebar. So it's just brick, stack on brick, stack on brick.
Okay.
So we knew going into this that those were more vulnerable and they should probably be retrofitted first. If, because that was essentially what the question was. It was, here we have this building stock here. Which buildings should we prioritize for our efforts? I mean, obviously, money being an issue, they can't retrofit everything. So which ones should come first?
Okay. So is that a poster or a presentation that you're giving?
It was a presentation.
Cool. How was it? How did it go?
It was a 5-minute talk. It was good. It was for the NERI Sim Center, essentially, again, because I've been using their R2D stuff. I've been using their platform, and I've also been using their brain. I was asked to present the work that I've been doing.
So which project that you've done has been your favorite so far, would you say?
They all have their little things that I like about them.
Not a good answer. I need you to pick your favorite child here.
Oh my goodness. My favorite child, I would say Project 2.
Which one is that?
And to be the one that I presented on for the NERI Sim Center R2D. And it's very similar to Project 3. It really is. I think for me, I have a soft spot for when I struggle. And like coming out on the other side, I look back and I'm like, I don't know that I would do that again, but I really enjoyed it. And I think that's what the residual feeling is with that project. It was, I'd never used HASIS. I'd never done this ever. And for me, the work that was put into it now is paying off into a third project that I'm now cruising, for lack of better terms, through because of the amount of work that I put into Project 2.
Cool.
So that's why I would say Project 2 is my favorite. But also, I really want to shout out my liquefaction project. It is a problem child, but I still really, really liked it as it was my first project back in grad school. So I do also have a soft spot for it because, again, like I did it.
Cool. So between these two abstracts that you sent to me today, and then also including the liquefaction project, are those the three main components of your dissertation, would you say?
They are. There is also an aside to Project 2 that we're not exactly publishing, but it will go because the work was done. It will go in the body of work. It was looking at specifically regions that are prone to liquefaction.
Yeah, that's super cool. And I guess just putting everything into context of like the reason that I'm pressing for concise results to some of the problems that we're working on is that I think people really want to know results to complicated questions, even when those answers aren't always really simple to understand. First of all, I think most people aren't always given the right information in clear, sustained, easy ways for them to understand. So, for example, we have tons of professors and researchers, people at national labs, putting out high quality papers all of the time, but people don't always know what's in them. And then secondly, most people aren't going to go out of their way to like learn about what liquefaction is and try to determine what that means to their personal lives. And I think that's totally fair. Like sometimes books are boring and people don't want to read about earthquakes the same way that you and I might. So I think this ends up being a communication problem where the problem goes in both directions. The problem can be improved from both people sending the message and people receiving the message.
I think that's also preparing me for my defense as well. I think sometimes you're like in a room and then you just automatically assume that people are going to understand the words you're saying. They're like going to understand impedance contrast. They're going to understand resonance because these words are part of your everyday language that you're like, you just spit them out. You're just like talking and then you're like, impedance contrast. And even in the way that I think just then when you and I spoke about it, I didn't necessarily even really do a good job at explaining it because in my mind, I'm like, every time I like try to figure out a way of explaining it, it gets more and more complicated because I'm like, oh, wait, like, do you understand how like the angle goes? And think about it. It's the same thing in the soil. But then again, it's like if someone is not familiar with the physics of that, it still is very confusing. So I need to really also find another way of simplifying my research so that when someone asks, I'm like, oh yeah, this is what I did and not use quote unquote big words. And I'm still working on figuring out how to make it so that my work and my research is understood by a wide variety of people. It doesn't have to be just the people who work in the fields that you and I work in, because what we do, if we're not doing it for the broader public, what's the point, right?
And even like big words, you don't necessarily have to totally shy away from big words either. As long as they're defined somewhere, either on a slide that you're presenting or defined at the beginning of your conversation with somebody, if you're talking to someone in person, that kind of thing. Because sometimes you're right. Like sometimes the bigger concepts need bigger words, and those words are either helpful or necessary. So sometimes you want to use those big words to explain what a building frequency is, or for you to understand why not every building reacts the same way. So yeah, just excited to see the work that you and Lori and the rest of her group are doing all the time. It's really impressed me to see everything that you've accomplished during your time at Tufts and everything the group is doing.
Thank you.
Super excited that you're finishing up as well. So obviously you've been writing papers or like drafts of papers along the way during your research projects. Have you started your official dissertation as well?
I have a document. It's a working document. I have the chapters laid out. I have how I want it to read, if that makes sense. Because really, your dissertation is a story. I've seen it done in multiple ways, but I think for me, I wanted to read like a story. Like this project looks at reconnaissance in mapping liquefaction in disaster areas using remote sensing. I want that story to be very clear. And then the other story that I want to tell is our aging infrastructure or our aging building stock here in Massachusetts and how, I mean, I don't want to scare people. Like, I'm not saying, you know, oh my God, our aging, and like, that's not what the point is. The point is that we need to know, right? We need to know what we're up against. especially with climate change. So we need to understand what our building stock is, what it contains, like how many of this type of building do we have? How many URMs do we have? URMs being unreinforced masonry. How many wood structures do we have? And what are their vulnerabilities given different events? And again, not saying anything, is going to happen to it, but I think that we need to, as a culture, need to get into the habit of planning for the future as opposed to letting it happen. And then we're like, oh, let's spend, I don't know, $50 billion rebuilding. And it's like, well, if you had spent maybe like $1 billion 10 years ago, you may be only spending 10 billion today.
Yeah, no, that's a really good way to put it. I like that a lot. Okay, Christina, is there anything else science related you wanted to share with the people?
Science related. I want the public to know that there are a lot of us who really put a lot of work into bringing information that we know in the way that we know it. We're not trying to cause a frenzy. We really are just telling you the facts in the way that we know the facts. You may personally not relate to something because you don't understand it, but it doesn't mean that the person who's telling you it is lying to you. Because having been a researcher and working in science and really putting my heart into my research, the last thing I want to do is talk to you and
Yeah.
like, it is not worth my time to make up stories.
Yeah, I think people really appreciate hearing directly from working scientists. I think people love hearing from researchers like yourself at universities or researchers at the USGS or National Earthquake Hazards Program or the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. Yeah, I think it's great just to bring in any real scientists or professors who teach these topics, any way to get these messages across to the public of real work that's being done in our real world, and getting people to understand that these aren't made up stories. These are, as you said, these are the facts in the way that we know the facts. And I think that's reflective in some of the comments that I get where, 1 or 2 out of 10 comments that I get in response to posting clips of the episodes are going to be random internet haters who have some feedback over how I shouldn't be platforming scientists. But the other 8 out of 10 comments are people who love it and people who are really happy to hear directly from researchers. And I think that's starting to very slowly build up a little more trust between scientists and researchers and the rest of the public.
In general, I think we as scientists need to find the balance between the urgency of what we're seeing and not alarming people, if that makes sense, not causing distress with our findings. So that balance needs to happen. And I don't know what the right answer is, but I also do think that on the other side, I would never go into someone's space and tell them how to do their job and what their job should be. So I think sometimes especially when it comes to science, and it's always like the science part too, like until Fauci, I didn't think it was possible to tell a medical professional that you're wrong. So I think there needs to be a balance in how we communicate and meeting people where they are, but also for people to keep an open mind with what we are bringing forth to them.
This was awesome, Christina. Thanks so much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me. This was good.
Yeah.
And of course, I think you're doing really, really good. I love listening to your guests. And I call it the nerdy podcast. I hope that's okay, but I really, really like it.
Yeah, go for it. Call it whatever you want.
Keep on cooking.
No, I appreciate it. Thanks again.